On this episode of Still Loading, Final Fantasy VI Redux. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Still Loading podcast. I'm your host, Josh Koval, and today on the show, I am doing something that I haven't done really on the podcast yet. So a couple of years ago, I did an episode on Final Fantasy VI, and I actually am still proud of that episode. A lot of times I've said before that some of my older episodes don't hold up compared to my newer ones. I was still learning the ropes, and I'm sure there's, stuff you could pick apart about that episode. But overall, I consider that one of my better episodes. But I'm doing a redo of that. And not because I feel like the episode needs an updating, but because for the first time ever, I've been given a review copy of a book from an amazing company called Boss Fight Books, and they just recently had a book released called It's on Final Fantasy VI by an author named Sebastian Deken. The ebook version of this book is out, and the physical paperback will actually be released 2 days from today's release date. On July 13th, it'll come out. And joining me on this redo version of Final Fantasy VI is Brian from the Taste of Dragons podcast. Brian, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. How about yourself? I'm looking forward to talking Final Fantasy VI. Looking forward to discussing this book that you read, because it's new information. Let's see what was in that book. I'm looking forward to the episode.
Well, there wasn't a whole lot of necessarily new info, but what this book did offer by Sebastian, it's a really good book, by the way. And I'm not just saying that because I got a review copy. That's why I disclosed it. It was a review copy, but the book is good because it gives a really interesting analysis of the game. And so I guess we can start off by talking about like what the book does, and then you can also talk about your opinions on like the takes of like what I'm relaying. Obviously, go read the book for yourself, both Brian and you, the audience, because it's really good. But what the book does is that it focuses on the music of the game a lot. It focuses on how Uematsu, the composer of the game, is Nobuo Uematsu. For those who don't know, and I'm pretty sure I butchered his name. Do you know? Did I pronounce it anywhere close? Do you know?
No, you were pretty close. You were
Pretty
pretty
close.
close. Yeah.
Um, but so they talk about Uematsu's compositions for this game and how they relate to the individual characters' story arcs and how the overall score relates to the game's overall narrative. So a lot of the book is Sebastian breaking down how the theme from a specific character really complements that character's story arc. And so they talk about, for example, with Cyan, the character Cyan, for those who, spoiler alert for this whole episode, just in case. But Cyan has a really tragic story. A lot of characters, that's one of the tropes is like all characters in JRPGs have some bizarre tragic backstory. I think FS6 does it overall really well, but they talk about Cyan and how he mentions he's a knight, so he's very militaristic, but he also has a really heartbreaking story where the surprise villain of the game, Kefka, poisons his entire nation, and in doing so kills his wife and child, his daughter, I believe.
Yeah.
And so when you listen to the song, it's very militaristic, but there's moments of it where there's these tinges of sadness, and it usually occurs in the second half of the song, or actually it usually occurs kind of towards the beginning, and then it kind of changes because that's how to reflect his growth, as a character and how he copes with the loss of his daughter and his wife. And it goes into things like that. They when they talk about Gao and how Gao is like, he's a wild kid. He was raised in the wilderness, on the plains, on the basically in like Final Fantasy VI version of the African wilderness, and it's called the Veldt though.
Okay.
And they talk about how it's very kind of, it's got a much more, it's got a much more tribal feel to it. But then towards the end of it, it gets a little bit more serious. It's not nearly as fun. And that reflects Gal's story, because Gal isn't that deep of a character most of the time throughout the game, but when you do his optional side quest, you find out about his dad, and you learn about how his dad disowned him and how he's trying to live up to his father's expectations of him, just so he can feel like his father loves him, and his father rejects him, which is super heartbreaking. But you wouldn't know that unless you did the side quest, which was completely optional.
Hmm.
So the book goes into a lot of different, basically he talks about the leitmotif, the use of leitmotif throughout the course of the game. And let me actually Google the because I remember he explained leitmotif really well. I'm going to delete this part out. But I'm bad at explaining it. And because I didn't know how to explain leitmotif originally, leitmotif, for those who don't know, like me, when I first read the book, a leitmotif is a recurrent theme throughout musical or literary composition associated with a particular person, idea, or situation. So Terra's theme is probably the one that is used as a leitmotif the most often, because it will take her melody and then use it in other places and kind of contort it a little bit to fit the situation. Um, so
Okay.
that was the overview of the book. Like, I'm not, we're not done talking about the book, but that was the basic gist, where Sebastian went really deep into trying to explain, like, this is this character story arc, here's how this character's theme reflects their story arc. And it was good, it was super interesting, and it added a lot of depth to characters that I didn't give two shits about. I didn't care about Gao. I didn't care about even who's it, Strago, and who's the dog. Hold on, I have the character list up here and I'm blanking on it. Strago and Realm.
Okay.
I believe that, yeah, Strago is Realm's adoptive grandfather and one of the few remaining Magi. Realm is a young girl living in the town of Tamasa with a passion for painting.
That's right.
Yeah, so that's kind of like an overview of like what the book is about.
Yeah. So the book seems to so like you said, the book seems to conquer the musical elements of the game,
Yes.
which are very important, especially because this came out during the Super Nintendo days, and so the sprite work was very well done. However, there's only so much you can show on sprites. A lot of
Mhm.
your emotion you're getting is from the score, and so the Super Nintendo chip did have a much better musical or sound chip to it, and so yeah, it was very important for the music to portray what you should be feeling or what the character is feeling in that moment. And so I think that's a really interesting take or direction on where the book went with this particular game. And that's really that's something that's pretty cool.
It's a really good book. It's really well done, and what I love about, he talks about that. He talks about how all the artwork is very chibi esque. It's got that. It's very anime chibi style. It's not very realistic,
Yeah.
and the music kind of has to. He talks a little bit about the. I don't. I forget if he mentions it directly, but basically he was implying, at the very least, he was implying the concept of the uncanny valley. And for those who don't know what the uncanny valley is the concept that something is so close to being human but it's not, and it puts you on edge, it makes you uncomfortable. Prime examples of this are from the Polar Express, that Tom Hanks movie. I didn't get
Oh
uncanny
yeah.
valley from it, but a lot of people did.
Yes.
Uncanny valley, porcelain dolls are another reason. Why do you think people get creeped out by porcelain dolls? Because they're closer to being human like than not. And
Hmm.
it's not a human, and it just makes you a little bit uncomfortable. Mannequins are also similarly like that, but that's also why mannequins, that's one of the reasons why they don't make just realistic looking people to wear clothes, because it would scare away customers. It would make
Yeah.
everyone very uncomfortable. And
Yeah.
so he talks a lot about that, and specifically he brings it to the famous opera scene, which the opera scene, I don't know, I'll talk about his what he mentions about that in a second. But I want to ask you, Brian, what was your like first reaction to the opera scene? Because I had heard about it before I played the game, and it's it's a famous scene now. It's
It
a super
is.
famous scene in gaming history. So, what was your reaction to it the first time? Was it really powerful, or did it underwhelm? Not trying to say that the scene itself is bad. Just maybe you played it a little bit later when it wasn't as like groundbreaking to you.
Well, so I played the game when it first came out. I had a friend who had a Super Nintendo. I personally didn't have one, but I had a friend who did. And
Hmm.
so I'd go over there and I'd play it, and we'd play through it. And so when I was younger, I really didn't understand the weight behind it.
Hmm.
I think what was this? I forget what even year this was, but whatever year it was, I think I was only like 12 or 13 at the time. And so playing through it was just like, okay, this is just another scene, you know? And then when I played it later in life, and I got a lot more of the game, obviously,
Hmm.
understanding what the meaning behind it was, actually being able to piece together in my brain what these things were, things that correlated to one another from one scene to the next.
Hmm.
And the opera house was a pretty cool scene. I really enjoyed it. The boss fight at the end and everything. It was pretty. It was yeah. It was great.
It's funny because I remember when I first played it, I was like, "This is interesting. It's not what I was really expecting it to be." And then when you get to that boss fight at the end, where you fight, um, oh my gosh, it's that
uh,
octopus thing. I
yeah,
can't
it's
think of his name.
Ultros.
Ultros, yeah. I actually got underwhelmed because of that. I'm like, "This is how the scene ends with a joke." Like this guy comes in and like ruins this beautiful moment in the game, and it just all of a sudden he crashes through the ceiling and like, or maybe from underneath. I think it was through the ceiling though,
Hmm.
and just ruins the play, or ruins the opera. And I mean, they do a pretty good job of playing it off because the characters, every all the audience just thinks it's part of the opera. And
Yes.
so then at the end of it, the maestro, the conductor, or whatever, the director essentially just tells the audience, "Oh, you just wait for tomorrow night's show; it'll be even better." He just kind of plays into it,
Hmm.
acknowledging like, "Oh, this was totally part of the plan, right? Right."
Yeah.
Uh, but the point that Sebastian made in the book that I thought was really good in regards to the uncanny valley, to tie that back into this, was that the the voices for the opera, that the way that is used, you can only approximate a voice on a Super Nintendo so well, which is
Hmm.
not well at all. And but that kind of worked in the game's favor, because if you would have had this chibi Celeste, this really pixel art anime chibi version of a character singing with actual voice samples, you would have delved hard into the uncanny valley, and it would have been a lot harder of a sell, I feel like, because you're it's asking you've already suspended your disbelief with how the characters are portrayed, and now you're bringing in the real world after your disbelief has been suspended. You know what I mean?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
it probably would have made it a lot harder if they had actual, like, good solid audio. I don't think it would have been as powerful. What do you think?
I actually agree with that. The I have mixed feelings though about it personally, because um, on our podcast we do Dragons of the Week, where we deep dive into a specific person, and
Mhm.
so I've deep dived personally into both the director of this game, Yoshinori Kitase, and also with Amano, with
Okay,
Yoshitaka
the
Amano,
yeah, who was the
the artist.
concept artist.
Exactly. And so when I was doing Amano, it was interesting because you're seeing all these characters, like you said, they're all chibi version, they're all 8 bits or 16-bit, however many bits. But you're just viewing these sprites. And so what Amano was saying was that the way he views it is he does these beautiful drawings that you can see in the manual,
Mhm.
and that you can see if you look up the artwork. And the way he described it was that you are looking at a representation of this character on screen, but what you should be viewing this person as is my drawings. So it's kind of
Yes.
like a legend, like on a map or something like that, where you're
Mhm.
just, yeah, you see that's just a key, or that's just like a restroom, whatever, but you should be imagining the actual thing that it is. And
Yes.
so even though you are only seeing these chibi characters, you should be in your mind, you know, just viewing them as they actually look, which was interesting for this game because what was it, Celis, in his artwork she's blonde, but because in order to better represent her in the game, they gave her green hair, and so it is interesting how they did it with this game and with a lot of the other games as well. You can only do so much with the Mono's art.
And well,
uh,
it's funny because the art was so well done, and
yeah.
it's so stylized. Like it's interesting. Like Amano's artwork is so Japanese, but not anime. You
Hmm.
know, it's so interesting because whenever you see like, especially in video games, they've tied anime and video games really closely together. I mean, look at Dragon Quest, right? You know,
Oh
they
yeah.
it's literally Akira Toriyama doing the artwork for that series. Who, you know, for those who don't know, he is the creator of Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, and so it's anime and JRPGs have been tied closely together. And with Final Fantasy, while there is like some anime adaptations of Final Fantasy games, you never really get until Tetsuya Nomura took over. You never really got that heavy anime vibe from the games.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I mean, I really think you first started seeing it in Final Fantasy VII because what is it? Nomura was the character designer for that, which is why
Yes.
Cloud looks the way he does. I
Yeah.
love Cloud's look, mind you, but it's very anime.
Yes, it
Um,
is.
and I think it's weird because I just could never picture, like I couldn't do what you said with this, where like I would see the sprite and then picture Amano's artwork as that, just because his artwork just was so different, and it's not bad different. It's just it doesn't they don't look close enough. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? Some of them do.
Yeah.
Like I think Cyan really. I'm looking at artwork of it right now, and I think Cyan looks really good. I think Saban looks really good. Shadow, I mean, it's just a ninja, but Shadow
Oh
looks
yeah.
pretty good. And
He's basically just Snake Eyes, really, from
pretty
GI Joe.
much. Oh my goodness. But I don't know. It doesn't always work for me. But what but in the boss fight book, they really like the author, once again Sebastian Deken. He really just talked about like that uncanny valley and how it worked for the opera scene and how the chibi versions of the art kind of are meant to suspend your disbelief to an, and I understand it was basically from technical limitations that they had to do it, but I think it worked really well for
Hmm.
this. I feel like if you would have done this realistically, like if you would have gone for a more realistic art style and kept the voice samples, you would have had Uncanny Valley again to a different degree, just because the characters look so quote unquote real, and then the voices and the music doesn't sound it. Like I feel like the sounds and the music perfectly complement the art in this game, like just really really well.
I agree. I wholeheartedly agree.
But he also goes into a bunch of the other characters. I guess we could talk about some of these characters here, and I feel kind of bad actually thinking back now because like this is definitely, I mean, I guess most people who would listen to this are people who've already played Final Fantasy VI, but for those who haven't, before we kind of talk about the characters, the basic overall premise of this game is that there is two warring factions, the Gestalian Empire and then a rebel group called the Returners. And the Gestalian, or the Empire as they call them, is harboring, not harboring, they are capturing these beings called espers, which are what are the summons of the game. You find out later they're
Correct.
essentially the summons of the game, but they harvest their magic from them because magic has not existed for, you know, what, thousands of years. What was it, like
I
3,000
think,
years
yeah,
or
something
something?
like that. Yeah, I can't remember the exact, but yeah, something like that.
Because they mentioned this thing called the War of the Magi, which they don't really talk all that much about. Am I wrong with that, or do they give more about that than I think? I don't
They
remember
don't.
much.
It's just they just touch on it here and there, especially when you get to Celis's backstory, and her memories. But no, you don't go, as far as I remember. You don't go too far into it in the game.
That's what I thought. That's what I thought. And so they've captured this girl named Tara, who is, this actually leads to a good question. Who is the actual main character of this game? I would argue it's Tara, but it's possible it's not because she is not always controllable. Because it's like Tara is the main character almost for like one half of the game, and then maybe Celeste would be the main character for the last half.
Yeah.
Would
Well, the way that they wrote this game, or even that they came up with this game, was they initially didn't want a main character at all. They wrote every
Mm.
single character to be a main character in whatever eyes that you can see them as, including Kafka. They were all supposed to be main characters, and so. However, Kitase was like, "Well, I might have went a little overboard with Terra and and Kafka, but no. Initially, when it was being summarized or come up with, I should say, yeah, it was there was supposed to be no main character. It was everyone.
That's what I thought. And but it basically starts off with Terra is the first human in millennia, thousands of years that is able to use magic at all.
Yes.
For years, no one's been able to use magic. So the Empire is controlling her with this, very sci-fi brain, like mind control helmet or crown that they're making her do everything, do their commands. She gets rescued in the beginning, and it's all about how she kind of joins the Returners and how they're fighting the Gestalian Empire, so that way they don't take over the world. But also, you do find out later on one of the Espers who is still alive over in this world. You find out later there's a whole separate world that you can travel to where the Espers live, and that's how they broke through, and that's where magic came from. And so
Mm-hmm.
they shut it off once humans obviously showed they can't be trusted with magic.
Nope.
Very much, it's very similar to like I wonder if it's like a metaphor for like the nuclear arms race. Granted, this was a couple years after the Cold War ended, but still, like I feel like it was probably on everyone's mind.
Yeah, probably.
I feel like it definitely. Oh, actually, that would make a lot of sense because Japan is the only country ever to get hit by a nuclear bomb.
They are.
So I'm not surprised actually that I mean that's one of the reasons Kojima has so many political overtones in his game. That's not the reason, but I'm sure it plays into it.
I agree.
But anyway, they're trying to stop this other Esper who, like I said, is a summon and also provides the world with magic once, not by giving it though, is usually forced and like drawn out, like sucked out of it. He tells the characters, the Empire's doing this to other Espers, you have to go save them. And you do, and in the process you find out that Terra is, once again, spoiler alert, is half Esper half human, which is why she can do magic. And is Rama her father? I can't remember.
It's I think it's either Rama or it's somebody else. I forget who it is, but yeah, her father is one of the Espers.
Yeah, so you find out she's half Esper, which is why the Empire wanted her in the first place. And the game throws probably the biggest plot twist of any RPG ever, and I think it's done the best. Like I've there's other games that throw different plot twists. I've joked around off mic with friends how much I love Final Fantasy VIII, but the big plot twist in that is that all the main characters magically grew up in the same orphanage and they all
Yep.
forgot. Like that's so stupid. That's not. It's so bad.
I'm with you. Yeah, that was also not one of my favorite things to ever happen in a Final Fantasy. But you know what? That's what they wanted to do with that game. I'm not here to tell them what to do.
It's just so dumb. It's so I can't get over that. At least like Seven's plot twist was kind of that like it happened relatively early on in the game where you find out the villain isn't like Shinra's a bunch of bad guys, but the real villain is Sephiroth and he's still alive. So there's not much of a plot twist in Seven from my memory of it at least.
The plot twist in Seven was that Cloud wasn't actually, his memories were
That's
completely
what it
altered.
is.
That was
Yeah,
the big twist, and then the twist also, again, spoiler if you haven't played Seven, Cloud is also was
the
experimented
clone.
on, yeah, and is a somewhat of a clone of Sephiroth, or had Sephiroth genes or cells implanted in him. So that's
I
why
want to
he's
see him just
drawn to
wearing a
him.
pair of Sephiroth branded jeans.
Yeah.
It's a fashion statement.
Exactly, right. Oh, and
uh
by the way, Terra's father was Maduin.
Madeline.
That's
Okay.
who it was. Yeah, it wasn't
Okay.
Rama.
All right. Which I guess Madeline was. He's still. Is he dead or is he over in the Esper world? I don't remember.
He is
I.
actually the guardian of the Esper worlds,
That's what it is. So
and he's overseeing the gateway between the Esper realm and the realm of humans.
okay.
So yeah.
So the big plot twist in 6 happens though, where you think the villain of the game for the entire game is the Emperor of Gestal. the Gestalian emperor, and only to find out that his right hand man Kefka betrays him, kills him, and literally causes the apocalypse. It's the only game that I can think of. I'm sure there's some, but it's one of the few games where the villain of the game wins.
Yep.
He defeats you. You doesn't matter what you do, the world will be destroyed. And that's where, kind of like, if you want to consider Celeste as the main character, takes over. It's called the World of Ruin, and you control Celeste, and you have to regather everyone in the party so you can go back and fight Kefka. Basically, just let's do it one last time, one last ride, and
Yeah.
just take them out. And that's a very basic overview of the story. So I kind of wanted to at least talk about that real quickly before we really go into the different characters and whatnot. But there's but all the different characters, you have Terra, who, like I said, she's half Esper, half human. She is the first character you actually meet, because it's got one of the most memorable openings of any JRPG that I can think of. What do you think?
um yeah, it's the opening is pretty interesting. I agree. It's very memorable, as you say.
It's very what? Sorry.
It's very memorable, as you say.
Yes.
Yeah.
I remember when I played it for the first time. I didn't grow up with this like you did, but I played it for the first time 5-ish years ago. I don't remember anymore.
Uh-huh.
Probably 5 or 6. And what it struck me was how much like a movie the intro was, which surprised me. I'm like, wow, Super Nintendo is making this feel like a movie. That's pretty cool, because I
Oh
hadn't
yeah.
seen that from a Super Nintendo game before. And admittedly, I didn't grow up with the SNES. It was something I definitely am old enough to have. I just didn't have it as a kid. My parents didn't buy it for me.
Hmm.
Um, so going back to it, I'm like, wow, this is really impressive for a 16-bit game. It's got that nice Mode 7 intro of all the mech suits walking into the horizon.
Hmm.
God, I love Mode 7.
Mode 7 is great, and they actually made a huge use of it in this game. I think in 4 and 5, they didn't use it for the overworld map. So they actually did that with this one, and made much more of a concerted effort to use Mode 7. And I also, yeah, like you said, the beginning, especially like the Star Wars nature of it, where it's like, 1,000 years ago, the world was in, they're doing this whole like opening bit for it in text, as they're just showing clips of the game. And I love that this is the first game where they actually introduce, or they show, there's a character's name, Biggs and Wedge, which I love. uh,
Yes, that
which
repeats
goes
in
with the
almost
Star Wars
everyone.
themes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it does. Yeah, you're right. I didn't even think about that.
Hmm.
I love the intro, because even the intro music. Maybe I'll include a clip of it right here. But the intro music, it kind of sounds like a western, that da 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 da
Oh
da
yeah.
da. And it very much kind of has that same vibe, because even though these are the bad guys, minus Terra, who's being brain controlled at the time, mind controlled, excuse me.
Yeah.
And but it's like it's very reminiscent of like the three cowboys walking into town, for the showdown at high noon type of thing. I don't think that's what they were going for, but that's just what kind of came to my mind when I'm seeing it.
Uh-huh.
And I remember the first time that I was playing it, and the opening credits just feel like it goes on so long. But now when I replay it, I'm like, I just don't want it to end. I just love that song so much.
Yeah, the soundtrack for this is incredible.
Well, in uh the book, Decken also mentions like one of my favorite one of the best examples of the music was Kefka's theme, because Kefka, as we've said, he's the villain who destroys the world. His song is so perfect for his character
Hmm.
because it starts off really comical. It's he's a clown. Kefka is a clown. That's, and I'm not saying that to be sarcastic. Like, he has clown makeup on and he's dressed very colorfully, and he is meant to be a clown. And so the music is very kind of like dun, 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 dun. And that's not his theme, but it's very humorous. It's very clumsy. It's very, I don't know how else to really describe it. It sounds like clown music though. But
Yeah.
as the piece goes on, it starts to pick up speed and get more menacing. And it's very much like his character arc, where he starts off kind of silly and kind of just he's awful. Like, he's a legitimate awful person. Because I mentioned before how Cyan lost his wife and kid in the poisoning. Kefka is the one who poisoned the water supply. Somebody's poisoned the
The
water
water
hole.
hole. Yeah. That's
Sorry.
where I was going. No, no, no. I was thinking that exact same thing. I'm glad you said it.
Sorry, I started thinking about it. I'm like, oh my god, it's like Toy Story.
Yeah.
But Kefka poisoned the water hole, which is very reductive of what actually happened. He literally committed genocide.
Yeah. Yeah. In all seriousness, he's a monster. Yeah.
He is a awful human being. Uh, I can't, I feel so bad making that joke now, considering what he did. He commits a genocide. I'm like, somebody poisoned the water hole.
Hey, it's a video game, all right? It's not real
It's
life.
true.
It's
It's true.
okay, you know?
Uh, and but Kefka is a monster. But the song was so representative of his character arc. Like, it starts off so comical and just goes crazy by the end, and that's what Kefka is. He literally just wants the apocalypse for no other reason than he's the Joker. He is the Joker. The whole idea of like what Michael Caine said in The Dark Knight. Some men just want to watch the world burn, and that's
Yeah.
Kefka. That is Kefka to a T.
Hmm.
What are some of your favorite characters, man?
Oh man. I really enjoyed Terra, and I mean, I'm a sucker for people with amnesia. Cloud's also one of my favorite characters. I mean, like, that's just who I am. I'm sorry. Uh, but
Don't apologize.
but I love Terra. Man, I liked Mog. Mog, actually
Really?
having a playable Moogle. Um, I loved. I mean, like, there's 14 different characters in this game, two of which are secret characters that you can get on the second half of the
I
game.
think it's Umaro and
And,
Gogo.
and Go-Go, yeah, and and one of them is a Yeti. Like, come on, like,
Umaro, yeah.
like, yeah, like, I mean, this has some of like the most playful character designs and character backstories, and like we said earlier, everybody's written to be a main character, and so it's hard to not like all of these characters. um it really is. Like, I've really enjoyed all of them. Shadow's great because he goes from working for the Empire to working with you, and becoming a playable character. It's, I don't know. It's hard to pick any one or two of them.
Shadow's an interesting character too, because do you know what his backstory is? I had no idea because I didn't do his side quest. I screwed up. Shadow is the only character that you can actually kill if you don't. When Kefka destroys the world, if you don't wait for Shadow there's this floating continent. That's how Kefka destroys it. There's a floating continent that he sends crashing into the earth, and if you don't wait for Shadow as you're trying to get off the floating continent, Shadow dies. And if you don't wait long enough for him, and I didn't know, I don't want to spoil that part, I guess, because I think it's kind of fun that can happen if you don't do the right thing. And it's not hard to do the right thing. You just have to. I don't want to go into it any further, but
Yeah,
Shadow can die.
yeah.
Did you know what his backstory was though?
I did, but to be honest, I am drawing a blank right now.
So
But fill me in. Fill me in.
So one of the other characters, her name is Realm Arani. She's a young girl who lives in the town of Tomasa with a passion for painting, as I read earlier, directly off of the wiki. Totally me, not off the wiki. Um, but so Realm is, I believe she can also do a little bit of magic, and she can do a thing where her paintings come to life. That's one of the parts of the story when she joins your party. I think you have to stop one of her paintings. It's been a minute since I remember her, but
I believe that sounds right.
what's interesting about her character is that she is an orphan and she was adopted by another character named Strago, who is an elderly blue mage, and he's actually like Strago is interesting because does he pass away? I don't remember. Maybe I'm thinking of a different game. Maybe it was Final Fantasy IV.
No,
There's a mate.
he does not pass away because he's one of the playable characters.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
There's maybe I'm thinking of Final Four then, because in Final Four you get like this elder mage or something, but he ends up dying towards the end of it. Like
Hmm.
he's playable for a short bit,
Gotcha.
but then he passes away. But anyway, so Strago adopted her, but her actual dad is Shadow. You find out through, and they don't explicitly say it, by doing her side quest and Shadow's side quest, you're able to kind of piece together that Shadow is actually her father. And he has a hard time kind of coming to grips with like taking responsibility of being her dad.
Uh huh.
And it's nothing really implied. Sebastian does such a good job of this in the book, and I really wish that I could explain it better. But his section on Shadow and his theme, and then in turn realm and her theme, is really really interesting because you get a lot more depth to these characters that admit, like, Shadow doesn't have much backstory throughout the game. You know very little about him, but by learning about this and learning like how much more you can find out about all the different characters through their backstories. Same with Setzer we haven't mentioned before. He is a gambler who he's the reason you get an airship later on.
Yep.
He's a gambler and a womanizer, and you find out one of the reasons he's actually an awful human being too, but
Yeah.
um he's he's not a good person, but he's redeemable, or he's redeemed because you find out his wife, the love of his life, died in a race that they were racing each other's airships, and her airship crashed, so he constantly blames himself for it.
Yeah.
um yeah.
This has one of my favorite Sids as well. I really enjoyed this Sid. All he cares about. He's the one that invents all of the Magitech stuff. So he's the one that invents all of the armors that the Empire is using and everything.
Hmm.
But it's not like he's evil. The Empire's letting him do his work, and that's what he enjoys. That's what he wants to do. And so he's neither good nor evil. He's just, technology based. He's all about his work. And
Yeah.
in the second half of the game, when you wake up as Celis, it's Sid who's been the one that's taken care of her for the last year while she's been in a coma.
Hmm.
And Sid, during this sequence, can actually, depending on how well you do taking care of him, because now he's sick, uh, depending on how well you do, he can also die. So it's one of those. I thought it was very interesting that now you are forced to take care of him, whereas he's been taking care of you this entire last year after the continent blew up. And I like that the dichotomy of that.
And I did not do well with taking care of him on my first and only playthrough.
Uh huh.
He died, and it gets even more morbid because Celeste can't is so like saddened by this. She's so remorseful and bereft. That's the word I couldn't think of. She's so bereft. She tries to commit suicide. She jumps off
Yeah.
a cliff. This game, I will never understand why. How I can understand if people's view of video games as an art form is just Mario Brothers. I can understand why people get, like, the snobby art critics are like, oh, that's not high art or something like that. But even just based on Mario Brothers, it should be, because you're designing an experience. But whatever. Um, with this though, if they're more concerned about story, about a story that tells that gives a purpose and tells something that says something about humanity that either needs to be said or they didn't think about, or like maybe it's a good character study or whatnot. Final Fantasy VI has so much in it, and it's not even just like we've mentioned so far. A lot of the stuff that's been hidden behind optional side quests. Like I mentioned, Gal reconnecting with his father, and by reconnecting, it's just realizing that his father still doesn't care about him, which
Hmm.
is heartbreaking. Or you find out Setzer's tragic backstory. You find out Shadow and Realm's backstory about how they're related, but he abandoned her, and but you have to do a lot. You actually have to play through the game twice technically to get all that information. So a lot of it is hidden because you can only find that out if Shadow dies, and or you can only find out half of it for the path where Shadow dies, and you can find out the other half for where you save him from the floating
Ah,
content. You can't do it all in one playthrough.
gotcha.
But even if without those, I still go back to Cyan. I've talked about this on other episodes. I don't remember which, so I think it's been a while since I brought it up. But Cyan has one of the most heartbreaking but interesting character stories, character arcs I've ever played in a video game. Like I mentioned before, his wife and child are murdered by Kefka, who poisons and commits genocide of his entire. He's literally the last one. He's literally the last person of the kingdom of Domo who Kefka just murders everybody.
Hmm.
And when you're trying to escape from that, at this point in the game, the characters that you have known have been split up due to fighting Ultros, which is that octopus we mentioned from the opera scene earlier. um so you actually have these three different scenarios that you have to play through. One as Locke, which we haven't mentioned him as a character. There's so many characters in this game.
There's so many characters.
One is Locke, another as Terra, and I want to say Bannon, who is the leader of the Returners, the resistance group. And then, Edgar is with them as well. We also didn't mention Edgar. Edgar is a king,
Yep,
who
he's
is
the king.
he is the king. Oh my god, I feel so bad for people who've not played this game. We're just like mentioning, oh, you know this character, right? Totally.
There's 14 characters and they're all written so well. It's just so hard.
So we won't focus too much, but there's a character named Edgar who is a king. He is with Terra, who is, like I said before, arguably the main character of the game. But Sabin, his side story, Sabin is the brother of Edgar, and he gets separated. He on his side quest, or his, like, not side quest, but his side of the story is where you meet Cyan for the first time. He comes across the kingdom of Doma and meets Cyan, and that's also where you meet Shadow for the first time. And he witnesses Cyan, like he comes up to the encampment right when Cyan finds out that the entire kingdom has been poisoned and whatnot. So he helps them, and then they continue to travel because they're trying to get back to the returners. On the way of traveling back to the returners, they go through this forest and they come across this thing called the Doom Train. Really dumb name. That's just a localization choice that I don't like at all.
Hmm.
But maybe that's what it was called in the original Japanese text, though I
I
doubt
think it's
it.
called the Phantom Train.
The Phantom, that's what
I
it is. It's
think
not
that's
the
what it
Doom
is. Yeah.
Train. Phantom Train. That's a lot better. Um,
Yeah.
so the Phantom Train in this world is the train that runs between that ferries deceased spirits to the afterlife. And since he had just witnessed his wife and child be murdered, he sees their spirits boarding this train, and it is absolutely heartbreaking. So he has to live with this idea, like he's not sure what he want. Like he follows after them, and they don't know what this train is for yet. And they all follow on, and only to find out that this will take them to the afterlife, which they don't want to go just yet. But Cyan has to determine, like, do I help stop this train, or do I just kind of, I can be happy again. I can be happy with my wife and kid, and that's heavy. That's
Yeah.
like if you got one more chance to be with your loved one, like what would you do? Would you? But it involved you going to heaven or hell. Hopefully not hell, but it involved you going to the afterlife with them. Like, what
Hmm.
would you do? And that's a very heavy topic, and
It is.
it just bothers me when people are like, "Oh, video games aren't art." I'm like, "Well, explain this, bitch." Like, come on.
Yeah. And that all really does own up to the director Yoshinori Kitase. He, we said earlier this is kind of like Star Wars, and that's because it was. One of his things when he was 12, he saw Star Wars in theaters and was hugely hugely moved by that. He
Mm,
went into animation because of that. He got
really?
yeah he went to university for animation production, and then he actually joined an animation studio and worked on a bunch of different things there. But while he was there, that's when he discovered RPGs. He was playing
Okay.
like Dragon Quest, and then he played Final Fantasy, the very first one, and he was like, "Wow, you can do this with the gaming medium. Like this is what can be done with this." And so he ended up quitting his job at the animation studio, and that's when he saw an advertisement at Square, and he was like,
Okay.
"Hey, these are the guys that made Final Fantasy. Let me go ahead and see if I can do it." And he had like he had no experience whatsoever in like coding or any of this other stuff. And he actually had his interview was with Hironobu Sakaguchi,
Oh,
and
wow.
and and he nailed the interview apparently because he made it. And so he worked his way up. His first game he worked on was Final Fantasy Adventure, and
Okay, that was the
so
one for the Game Boy, right?
yes, it
Or
was. That was the first entry in the Secret of Mana series, if you want to say, because
Seiken Densetsu, yeah.
yes. And so that was his first game he worked on, and then he actually worked with Sakaguchi on Final Fantasy V. Both him and Sakaguchi worked on all of the cutscenes. They
Okay.
wrote and created all of the cutscenes for Final Fantasy V, and then Sakaguchi actually got like promoted to vice president at Square, which is why he didn't do Final Fantasy VI. So he passed it on to Kitase, and so Kitase's influence on Final Fantasy VI is why it is so drama heavy and why it's so character focused, because that's what he's always wanted to do. That's what he's always viewed what video games could be,
Okay.
and that's why they took up the writing every single character as if they could be the main character. He personally actually is the one who wrote the opera house scene, fishing with Celis, that entire scene. He
Mhm.
did a lot of the weighty moments, because that's what he felt like games could be. And yeah, it's he was a huge influence on this game. And yeah, that's why this kind of feels the same, but so much more than the previous Final Fantasy games.
Dude was so busy too, because just a year later, he released Chrono Trigger.
Yeah,
This is the other like heralded JRPG,
yeah,
one of the other top ones on the Super Nintendo, and obviously he then was the director and scenario. Well, he's credited as a scenario writer, which is the storyteller in the old games.
hmm,
But he was the director and scenario slash story writer for Final Fantasy VII
yep,
and eight. I'll forgive him for I love eight. Eight's actually one of my favorites of all time,
uh huh.
but that story is stupid as hell.
Yeah, oh yeah, I
Uh,
agree. I agree.
it's a stupid, stupid game. And then also he is the director of Final 10 as well. And yeah, and then I think then he got promoted, it seems like, to be the producer role. I don't see too many other director credits to him after 10.
Yeah. After 10, he like executively produced Crisis Core Final Fantasy 7.
Okay.
He produced some of
Really?
13 as well. And yeah, he's actually on the Final Fantasy committee. If you don't know what that is, they oversee like everything that has to do with Final Fantasy, from licensing to what can be used in Final Fantasy, what kind of brands they're doing, all that other
Mhm.
type of stuff. He's actually on that still. And so um, yeah, he actually also did the Final Fantasy VII Advent Children movie. He came like I called it as he came full circle, because he started in animation, and then he ended up working on the animated movie of Final Fantasy VII Advent Children. And so I love that little thing that from Kitase. But yeah, like he there's so much of him in this game, and it's one of the things I really enjoy and I love about this game is just the writing, because again, you didn't normally see it in these types of games.
I definitely agree. I feel like so I played four. So for those who don't know, we've it's fairly common knowledge now, but just in case for those who don't know, maybe I even should have mentioned this at the top of the episode. But Final Fantasy VI was released as Final Fantasy III originally here in the
Yes.
states, and Final Fantasy IV was originally released as Final Fantasy II here in the states. Long story short, one Final Fantasy One came out in Japan and the U.S. Good number of years apart, but they came out in Japan and the U.S.
Yeah.
they never really, well, they did eventually, but at the time in the late 80s, early 90s, they decided to not bring over Final Fantasy 2 and 3. But they did decide to bring over Final Fantasy 4, which was the first one on the Super Nintendo. And they're like, all right, let's bring Final Fantasy 4 over. Oh, what? Those Americans didn't get 2 and 3? All right, we're just going to call this one 2, just so
Yeah.
we don't confuse them. And then they decided to not bring 5 over. And they're like, we'll bring 6 over. Oh, but they also didn't get 3, 4, or 5. So we're just going to call this one 3.
Yep.
And then Final Fantasy 7 came out. They're like, fuck this. And we just released it as 7.
Yeah. I will say I was definitely confused because I
Yeah.
had played 3 when it came over. And then my friend got a PlayStation. He got Final Fantasy 7. And I was like, wait, what? What? What's going on here?
It doesn't make any sense, man. It makes
No.
no sense. It's so weird.
And one of the other thing I loved about this game was that originally the game was going to end on the floating continent. There was going to be no like skip a year ahead.
Oh, really?
It was originally going to end there, and you were going to save the world. Like you were actually going to defeat Kefka and everything. But they were actually running ahead of a schedule. They were running ahead of time, and things were going so smoothly. They're like, all right, we can bite off a little bit more. Let's add to this game, and then that's where all the second half came from.
That's
It all came
so
from that.
crazy how it was
Yeah.
more of an afterthought. Like it wasn't even part of it. And that's the fact that Kefka wins. It's weird because I think what's beautiful about what it says is that there's no apparent metaphor involved with it. Like they're not trying to say, I'm sure in Kitase's mind he was thinking about something, but like they don't say it in the game. Like it's very much okay, Kefka won. Now you have to regroup and take him back. Like, take
Hmm.
him down. And the world is shit now because Kefka won. It's awful. They don't overtly say anything meaningful about the fact that you lost. What I kind of like about that is it leaves it up to the player's interpretation as to what why did you do this to us? Why did you
Yeah.
is it that no matter what I do this fails? And I feel like by the fact that they left that so open, and it's not like the world of ruin happens and Kefka wins and then all of a sudden you have like 15 more hours of play. You have only a couple, and it's as much or as little as you want because you can do the bare minimum and get just what you need and then go on and fight Kefka.
Yeah.
You can do that,
Yep.
but it's not necessarily advised because there's a lot of monsters you have to fight, but you can do that.
Yeah.
And it's short. So if they would have made that last portion of it long, I feel like it wouldn't have been as impactful. Like I feel like by allowing almost like the silence of the event to hit the player, it allows the player to feel more about what's going on and kind of draw their own conclusions about what they're trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
Hey everyone, just wanted to pop in here real quick and give a shout out to my friend Adam Lau. He was actually going to be on this episode because he is a video game fan and he's also a professional opera singer. So I thought, wouldn't it be cool to have a professional opera singer on the episode in which a Final Fantasy game has an opera? Unfortunately, our schedules could not align, but I still wanted to shout him out because he is an awesome person, and I wanted to share his stuff because the arts were hit hard over the pandemic. So I wanted to give him some shout outs. So please go check him out. You can find him on Instagram at The Hungry Panda. That's THEE, Hungry Panda. And also his YouTube channel, which is just Adam Lau. I will provide a link in the show notes to his channel, as well as a video that he wanted to share with everyone. So that's all I got, and on with the show. So you may be surprised, Brian, that one of the biggest revelations to me in the Final Fantasy VI book by Sebastian Deken was when he asked Uematsu, like, how did you plan out these individual themes for the characters? Like, how did you determine, like, was it very, like, how intentional was it? Like, because a lot of these characters' themes, he goes into a bunch of them, they all feel like they match the character's story arc. You'd be surprised to know that he had wrote the themes before he knew about the characters and then matched them to the characters after the fact.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Huh.
So for as well matched as these themes are, especially Kefka's and Terra's and Celeste's, Terra's is really interesting because it's really much like the theme of the game. Like it's used as the overworld, like the world map music for a good chunk of the game, or a version of it, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
But he chose that all after the fact. It was not part of his original plan.
Huh.
Uh he wrote all the music and then assigned it the character. It's not like he looked at the character and was like, all right, how can I write this song best to fit this character? No, he just wrote everything and then figured out how to put it in later. I think that's a really weird but awesome strategy. I don't know. I feel like you have to be intentional with it. Like, what if you just wrote something that didn't fit anything? You just wasted your time.
Yeah. Well, I Umetsu is just like a songwriting machine. He
Hmm.
he just what he did, like, day in and day out, morning to night. He was just writing songs, and so I can see that working specifically just for him. Uh, but yeah, I agree with you because, like, this game I think was only developed in like a year, and so you have to just pump stuff out and see what can fit. And since he's been doing Final Fantasy music, for what, 10 years now, or however many years it's been at this point. Uh,
It wasn't
he
that
kind
long.
of,
The original Final Fantasy came out in like what? Actually, it's pretty close to 10. It might be 8, 7 or
yeah,
8.
something
So
like that. Yeah,
at the
whatever it
time.
was. Yeah, I mean, so he kind of knows, what would fit in that universe. So I can see it working specifically for him. But yeah, no, I agree with you. Like with the Kefka music specifically, is one of those, like, huh, this is very character specific and
Hmm.
plot specific as well, like his story arc specific. So yeah, that's interesting.
That just surprises me a whole bunch. Um, and for those who also like, I don't know why I'm bringing this up right now, but just why is the series even called Final Fantasy? I'm always surprised how many people still ask that. You
Oh
know,
yeah.
because I feel like it's been well documented. It's the company Square was going to go under, and they
Yep.
needed a hit game, so they called this one Final Fantasy because it was going to be their final attempt to stay in business, and well, it worked.
Yep.
Lo and behold, they're one of the largest companies in the gaming industry now.
Yeah.
It just Uematsu is just it's so interesting to me, especially his writing style, where like the famous intro to Final Fantasy, that like just the arpeggio that he's doing there.
Hmm.
They He wrote that in like 5 minutes or something like that. It was they needed something for a title screen, and it was like out of time, so he just threw that together, and it works so well. Like how I honestly wonder how much of that is a combination is skill versus just I don't want to say luck, but just like because I feel it was still intentional, but it just how did like I don't get how that works so well. I'm
I,
happy it does, but it works so well.
Yeah, I feel like it has to do with, like, kind of how you're on a deadline, and so sometimes some people work under the pressure the best. It's like the last hour, it's the last day, and something really important is to be done, and then something just clicks in your brain and it works. It's just like with, like, the what was it, the Legend of Zelda. Its original music, at least on the menu screen, was going to be like a licensed song,
Hmm.
but they couldn't get the rights to it. So it was like the composer had to come up with it. I think he came up with it in like the next like 10-15 minutes or something like
The
that.
Zelda
And now
song, the
that's,
Zelda
yeah.
theme,
Yeah, I
really,
believe so.
Koji
And
Kondo.
so yeah,
Wow.
I think that's what it was. And so it was like that was just come up on the spot because they couldn't get licensing to the original music that they were going to put in the menu. And that's one of the most iconic songs ever. And it's interesting how things work out, you know?
Hmm. And I've always been fast. Like it's well documented, but I'm always interested in the fact that Uematsu doesn't come to Final Fantasy through a classical music lens. Like he's not going for like he uses a lot of orchestra and stuff in his music, but it's never been like a here's Mozart writing the score for Final Fantasy VI. You know what I mean? He goes
Yeah.
with a very prog rock like he loves prog rock, and so he tackles a lot of his music from that lens, and you can hear it in like the battle theme, like
Yep.
that was an awful rendition of it. um do 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 do. Then you hear the bass line. Oh, it's so
Yeah.
good.
It's
uh,
it's so good.
okay, so we've talked a lot about the overall character, the characters, the overall story. Um, what I kind of want to close out on, because we've been going for almost an hour now. I know our timer's a little messed up, but what I want to know is how do you think this game holds up now? Like, do you think is there still stuff that people can learn from this game even today? Like, does it hold up, or do you think that it hasn't aged as well?
I think it absolutely holds up. I think it's because the writing is extremely on point. As we've mentioned earlier, it was written first, and then you got to build around it, and so it's still a really timeless story. And there's a reason it's still considered to be one of the greatest Final Fantasies, if not the greatest Final Fantasy in a lot of people's opinion. Period. I think it was IGN or something like that ranked it as their number 2 RPG of all time, like in 1997, or sorry, in 2017. So that was only a couple of years ago. Yeah, that's a little bit of a time difference.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, like it's still, I still think it holds up. I mean, a lot of the elements are now used in other games, such as a villain twist or some of these other like the poignant moments that we mentioned that were kind of first in the industry. And so I think even with that, it still absolutely holds up from the character specific sequences, all of the side stories. I absolutely think it holds up.
I have a theory that I feel like narrative in games really was pushed forward by RPGs, not just JRPGs, but like the RPG genre for a while, because action games for the most part didn't have these groundbreaking stories. Like Mario doesn't have a groundbreaking story. Mega Man has an interesting world, but none of the stories are really like, holy shit, this surprised me type of thing. There's no Last of Us of Mega Man.
Yeah.
Oh my god, imagine though. Um, but like I feel like RPGs for years, even before Final Fantasy, was the genre, and the RPGs and its origins within the gaming sphere really push forward narratives in games, and Final Fantasy VI is obviously no exception. I'm with you. I think this holds up surprisingly well. Especially, we didn't really talk about the mechanics of the individual characters. Like they made each character very unique. Terra does magic. I actually like Edgar a lot because he had like those tools that he could use, and
Yep.
the tools were so overpowered. So, uh, especially because there's no ammo, there's no limit. You can just keep using the tools over and over again, which I always found like, then what's the point of doing his regular attack if his tools are just much better than his regular attack? But
Yeah.
whatever. But each character is very different. They do a good job of representing the written character in his gameplay. Cyan is a knight, so he does a lot of physical damage. Strago, if did I get his name right? I forget already.
Yeah,
Strago, yeah.
Strago. Yep.
Strago is a blue mage, so he kind of has a little bit of everything. He does a little bit of everything with him. Celeste is a former general former general of the Empire and a Magitech knight. And so she can also use magic because she's been infused with some magic from the espers that was stolen by the Empire, and she's kind of almost like the warrior wizard almost
Hmm.
type of thing. Sabin, however you say his name, he is a brawler. He's a monk essentially. He suplexes and punches, and he also, because he does that, it also leads to the famous thing where he suplexes the phantom train.
Yes, he does.
It's fantastic. I love that.
It's the best.
You just suplex the train, just lifts the whole thing up and just pile drives it into the ground. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
um but the game does a really good job of telling a story and also using its characters to further, like, characters gameplay to reinforce the narrative each, or the character arc each character has, the story each character goes through. So just it holds up much better than I ever really expected it to. Not because I think when I first played it, I was still under the impression that, you know, older RPGs aren't always going to be great. But like, especially I think like 8-bit RPGs like on the NES aren't always the best in my opinion. Some of them hold up, and, you know, the original Final Fantasy is fine. Um,
Hmm.
some of the later Dragon Quest ones are pretty decent, though we had a Dragon Warrior here in the States for a number of years.
Yes, we did.
Um, but like Super Nintendo era is really where it seems like JRPGs got their stride, between the Dragon Quest games released on it, between the Final Fantasy games released on the Super Nintendo. Uh, excuse me. You have the Fantasy Star games, like Fantasy Star 4 on the Genesis is regarded as the best in the series. And then you
Yeah.
have Chrono Trigger, you have Earthbound, you have Secret of Mana, which was
Hmm.
Seiken Densetsu 2, right? I think that was the second
Yes,
one.
that is correct. Yeah.
Um, I've never played any other ones except Secret of Mana, and I never beat that either because I'm bad at it. It's a tough game.
Oh, it is. It absolutely is.
So I don't know. I'm with you, dude. Like it really holds up very well, and the artwork, I think, especially with games that Square has released recently, like Octopath Traveler, excuse me, and then their remakes that were announced of the Final Fantasy, the first, was it the first six?
Yeah, it's going to be the first six. They're going to be redoing the sprites and everything for it.
Yeah, I think the way they're redoing it pixel art still works, especially now with the indie scene really kind of coming into its own and kind of revitalizing pixel art. I mean, how many Twitter accounts now do you see that do just pixel art, and it's gorgeous? It's great.
Oh yeah. I mean, and the reasoning being behind that is because pixel art doesn't take anywhere near as much time as, you know, a fully 3D rendered, townscape or whatever. You know, it's the reason why they were able to make these games in a year with only like 50 or 60 people. You know,
Yep.
uh, nowadays you can't even touch that with that amount of time if you do modern graphics or modern anything. So yeah, pixel art is still gorgeous. If it's well done, you know, even if it's not well done, it's still just a style that I think is kind of
Hmm.
timeless.
I agree. I agree. All right. Any final thoughts then? Any last things you want to say about Final Fantasy VI?
Not really. I mean, just Final Fantasy VI, like we just mentioned, is still timeless. I think if you haven't played it, you should. If you're even slightly curious about it, you should go out there and play it. It's such a great presentation of the art form that is RPGs, that is from the era. It's just so good. Um, it really is a disservice if you enjoy these games to have not have played it. That's my final thought. If you haven't played it, play it. It's so good.
I am 100% in agreement with you. It was the first time I played it, I was very impressed by it, and I feel like the more read about it, the more I listen to people talk about it, there's just new things like being completely honest, one of the best things I loved about the book by Sebastian Deken was how much more I got to know about the individual characters, because I remembered Terra's story. I remembered Edgar and Saban's story, and Science is the one that stuck out to me the most, and especially sticks out to me now that I'm a father.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
but like learning about Realm's story and Shadow's story and Strago's and Setzer's and Edgar's, a little bit more of Edgar's and whatnot, and then Gal's even, and it's a really good book, and that book only made me appreciate this game more. Like, first time I played it, the opera scene, I understood why people were so blown away by it at the time, but it didn't quite hit me as well, as hard as it hit other people. Like, it didn't impact me the way it did others. And but
Mhm.
reading his book, I was like, oh, I get this now. I understand where, like, why this is so impactful and why it meant so much to so many people. And he even gives, I forget it, and I really sad I can't remember the exact reason, but he even gives a really interesting analysis of, like, when Ultros crashes the opera, why that fits so well with the game and why it works so well. Because he talks about how they really like Final Fantasy VI itself, like the game in its entirety is essentially an opera, with tragic villains and tragic heroes and comedy, and it has a lot of the aspects of opera as a whole and not just the music. And I thought that was a really interesting take, and it wasn't what I was expecting. I was expecting just an analysis of the game, and while it was that, it was done instead of going through each story beat by beat and explain metaphors and looking into things. It was more just like a book on the character studies of the individual characters. And he doesn't go into everyone. Like, I don't think there's much to talk about with Mog or Umaro because they're not really deep characters. They don't really have tragic backstories
No.
as far as I can tell. Mog is just a Moogle, and Umaro is that Yeti thing, like you mentioned. And it's a good book. Like, I read through it and I enjoyed reading through it. It was something, and it's not that long of a read. I had it on my phone, and it was about 200 pages on my phone on as an ebook. So that's not going to be that long once you get out of the, like, if you're reading it in an actual like paperback thing. So definitely recommend picking that up. But yeah, that's all I got. That's all. I think we covered it pretty well. I think we dove into the characters. We dove into the story a little bit. We talked about its legacy. I feel like we covered this pretty well. What do you think, Brian?
I agree, actually. Especially, like you said, from the book aspect. Yeah, the composing and everything. Looking at it through that lens is just so unique, and I'm glad that's the way that Sebastian ended up doing it.
And I'm happy the way this episode went because it was not a typical like deep dive into a game. Like, normally when I talk about a game, I kind of talk about maybe level by level or story beat by story beat. But since I did that in the original version of me covering Final Fantasy VI, I didn't want to do that again.
Hmm.
So I wanted to try out a different format, I guess, like just trying to talk about the game more as an analysis versus as a just review, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
I think we did pretty well with that. So that should do it for this episode of Still Loading. Brian, where can the good people find you online, or what do you want to promote? I'm assuming, of course, the Taste of Dragons podcast.
Yeah. So we do. We're a podcast and a gaming network. So we release a podcast every Sunday. Uh, Normally it's around midday, but sometimes we're late. We're not perfect. And so we do a podcast every week. We have yet to miss a week since we've started over almost a half years ago.
That's
So
wild.
we've been doing that. We're a whole group of friends that love talking about games, love talking about our influences. Like I mentioned earlier, we do Dragons of the Week, where we pick a person that has either influenced us or someone even we want to know more about,
Hmm.
and we do a little bit of a deep dive on them towards the end of the episode. And so we also do research and that type of stuff. So yeah, that's the main thing I'd like to promote. We also have a Twitch where we stream almost every day of the week. But podcast is where it's at. Podcast is awesome.
I mean, yeah, you guys have it set out so you stream pretty much in the evening almost every day. Troy streams, I know, Thursday afternoons, which I always
Yes.
I always like to, when I was working from home, and I always try to put that on in the background,
Oh yeah,
which
yeah.
is
Troy
fun.
has he has such an infectious voice and an infectious laugh. It's always great to listen to him, uh, just enjoying himself.
Yeah. But all right, I think that's all we got. I think that's all I want to talk about for this episode. Thank you all for listening. As usual, you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at StillLoadingPod on all of them. If you want to reach out, you can contact me at stillloadingcontact@gmail.com. If you want to support the show, probably the best way to do that is give it a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts or whichever podcasting app you use. That helps more people find the show, and I it honestly, it means more to me that if you would just give me some feedback, hopefully good feedback, but I'll take all comers. And the other way you can support it is patreon.com/stillloadingpod. Even just $1 a month will help grow the show. And the most important shout out is the Bit by Bit Foundation. The Bit by Bit Foundation is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to put video games and video game consoles in the hands of children receiving inpatient care at hospitals. So if you want to support them, go to bitbybitfoundation.org and consider donating. And that's all I got for you. Thank you all for listening. Brian, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And I will see you all next time.